Like most Resident Evil games, there is always proof in concepts, prototypes, and developer builds that might be lost in history as we know it. This boardroom madness could cause imminent dismay for many fans who might spend countless hours quarreling over the removal of ideas. In my opinion, I would say that Capcom is courteous about reshuffling criteria from the drawing board and re-implementing them once again to create newer storylines. Resident Evil 0 had a few exceptions to the rule, especially when it comes to riskier gameplay principles that could have had a bigger impact than initially thought. I promise no high-priced DeLorean is needed for this one. So, I guess we're going back to the year 1997. Let's put ourselves in the shoes of Capcom. We're tossing around ideas for upcoming ports for Resident Evil 2 since Resident Evil 1 turned into an overnight grand slam. We're struggling with the N64 due to the cartridge-based system that was implemented at the time. That's no big surprise that this caused a headache since Squaresoft managed to bail out of this principle as well. Final Fantasy VII was then brought to the PlayStation 1, and that was a colossal loss for Nintendo in general. Being the determined assholes that we are to fatten our wallets, we took on this Galaxy Quest motto: never give up, never surrender. It was numerous attempts done just to see if we could shrink down RE2 just enough to make it fully operational on the N64. The results were flung into a piercing void since technical difficulties left the entire team feeling largely uncertain about the premise. Would you believe us if we said that only one fraction of the game was possible due to size limitations? Back then, the N64 could only carry 64 MB, whereas the CD-ROMs at the time had a higher storage space of 640 MB. The grim reality is that the PS1 had a lot of backup storage with video, audio, and ROM. Eventually, uncompressed sound would be a major issue when it came to getting Resident Evil 2 operational on a cartridge. I don't think it's an understatement to say that we did what we needed to get it done, even if we created a plot hole by using Claire's cutscene for Ada. It was a technical achievement regardless of all the shortcomings placed against the team as a barrier. Capcom wanted to see what they could do next with the Resident Evil title made from the ground up on the N64. It would be commissioned either through cartridges with more space or created with the 64DD in mind, which is a hard disk based version of the Nintendo 64. With the fortitude, experience, and willpower we had from the first concept, Resident Evil 0 arose from the ashes. This game was specifically penned by writers from Resident Evil Code Veronica and veteran creators who brainstormed the idea involving a prequel to RE1. If you played the final version, then you know the story concepts are mostly similar. Star's Bravo team immediately crash lands after a little bit of sabotage engine failure happens to their main chopper. A radio signals to inform that there's an escaped convict named Billy Cohen who might have taken refuge aboard a train called the Epileptic Express. It's no surprise that the train car is filled to the brim with victims of the T-virus. An outbreak was caused by Umbrella researcher James Marcus. This fragile alliance between Billy and Rebecca slightly dissolves as they are forced to work together to overcome this extreme nightmare. The gameplay circulating around this prototype build is akin to Resident Evil 2. Everything takes place in a pre-rendered fixed camera perspective where you have to examine items, fight enemies, and potentially solve puzzles in order to escape. A big component that was set to be implemented was the zapping ability. Initially, you take the role of Rebecca Chambers, but near a certain point at the beginning of the game, you are able to switch to Billy Cohen. Zapping mechanics aren't particularly new for Resident Evil, especially at the time, considering, well, Resident Evil 2 did it already. For the uninitiated, if you don't know what zapping is, then it's basically the idea of switching between two characters, each with their their own fundamentally different results, affecting their own individual campaigns. For example, if Leon takes the submachine gun from the armory in Resident Evil 2, then it will be gone for Claire in Claire B. If Leon decides to place a fingerprint in Leon A at the end of the lab terminal, then Claire can process hers as well in Claire B, leading to a secret area. The time finally came for real-time zapping, which was impossible on cartridge-based hardware according to Capcom. This means that the push of a button can determine if you could be the secondary playable character on screen, and you could switch back to the primary protagonist with relative ease. The final result was accomplished in a later revision of Resident Evil 0, and it was done in Resident Evil Revelations 2. I'm still pressing X to doubt on Capcom meeting this goal for the Nintendo 64 as they originally intended. After all, I would say we have to take space issues and slow down under advisement here. The most interesting change probably comes from the fact that you could still clear the game if the secondary protagonist dies under any condition. You see, in the final version of Resident Evil 0, this would constitute towards a game over if your partner dies. In the prototype build, you do not get a game over if Billy or Rebecca eats fertilizer if they aren't the primary character. Now, what does that mean exactly? It means that despite the partner-centric character dying, you could clear the game solo with the remaining protagonists. This is vastly similar to the original Resident Evil, where characters could die under certain conditions, and thus the ending will be altered depending on your actions. Capcom decided against this since they felt that it would cause timeline disruption if Rebecca Chambers did not live to see tomorrow in a non-canon scenario. Actually, I would say that the premise of multiple endings began to die down after Resident Evil Outbreak, but in my personal opinion, it added some replay value for Discovery. I mean, Resident Evil is all about infinite replayability in the first place, am I right? A few new gameplay features were added to the mix, like zombies having some subtle jerky animations when being shot. These were added to make things more intense and possibly catch the player off guard. The same goes for a mechanic where zombies could run, which was later revitalized for the GameCube remake, aka Crimson Heads coming at your door to mess your ass up in full sprint, baby. Speaking of monsters that can mess your ass up, did you know that there were a few cut creatures that were left out of the equation from Resident Evil 0? The first one was called the DALI, or Dolly for short. This creature was planned to be hatched from a cocoon in order to frighten the player with a number of attacks from the ceiling. The team couldn't get this creature to function correctly in a precise manner because it was this big hulking salamander, and it was later repurposed into the plague crawler that you see in the final build. The man spider from Resident Evil 1.5 was going to also make an appearance in Resident Evil 0. The anatomy and the name goes hand in hand here. Holy shit, the design of this creature is absolutely insane. We're talking about a giant arachnid embedding its entire body into the human spinal column. The spider legs protrude out of the human ligaments, and it seems like strength is definitely amplified with the human host taking the mantle. It was cut from the game because the developers thought that it was way too far-fetched for a Resident Evil game, even though we have a franchise where giant big-ass plants can eat off a human head. The last enemy was some kind of menacing ape creature that was called Wesker's Monster. The first draft of Resident Evil 0 didn't even feature James Marcus, so instead Albert Wesker was going to be the main antagonist at one point. His goal was to send creatures to eliminate Star's Bravo team one by one. This monkey was said to be a reoccurring enemy that will stalk Billy or Rebecca throughout most of the game to see this goal accomplished. After revisions to the script, this concept was cut and repurposed into eliminators that you see in the final build. I'd also like to give a big fuck you to Eliminators for even existing, by the way. There was also the potential of counterattacking if you were put into a struggle position, while Koji Oda also claimed that 2 zombies biting the player at the same time could seriously deplete your health. This was once again brought back in Resident Evil 2 Remake as an attack animation. Much of the map layout is similar to the finalized version for the GameCube experience, except a few key differences we talked about earlier. Wardrobe was also intended to be part of the plot, believe it or not. Rebecca Chambers initially had white fatigues, shoulder pads, a beret, and a med pack strapped to her body, which symbolizes her skills to the highest degree. Ironically, a lot of these things were lost in translation for the GameCube release and preserved when this outfit was recreated for the HD remaster. If you clear the game as Rebecca, then battle damage would be received throughout the course of the story. This was made to harden her resolve as the game progressed, culminating in her look with one red bandana given to her by Billy Cohen. If we talk about the idea of cosmetic changes, then it's unknown if this same sort of physical metamorphosis would have occurred for Billy Cohen if you decided to kill Rebecca Chambers off as the secondary character. However, Billy Cohen's beta design looked vastly different than what you would expect. He's almost akin to Wesker, which is what the developer intended, possibly, and he was even going to be possibly the final boss in the first draft. Resident Evil 0 certainly would have been changed completely if the core idea between hero and final boss ended up with them working together somehow. As usual, things evolved over time to give Billy Cohen a more normalized aesthetic to his design. The prisoner motif was the lifeblood to this secondary design, which came fully equipped with dangling handcuffs as a key trait. Ambition was the lifeblood of Resident Evil 0 on the N64. For example, they were even planning to add unique things like the ability to tackle this game with local co-op as an option for the first time ever. Once Capcom realized that the GameCube was looking pretty damn fresh for an opportunity, they decided to scrap RE0 on the N64 and move on to greener pastures with Nintendo's Purple Lunchbox. There's even a few secrets in the trial version of Resident Evil 0, like the option to customize the shotgun and magnum parts. Only handgun parts make it into the final game, but apparently things like silencer modifications were seemingly absent for unknown reasons. I'd assume that the team either ran into a complete balancing issue or they couldn't properly find a valid way to get all this stuff working if the enemy is always set to an attack pattern once detected. Just to break it down in layman's terms, that means that a silencer probably wouldn't work if a zombie already knows that you are well in the area. Therefore, if the enemies are always set to be alerted, then what is the point of a silenced gun in the first place? It's kind of like what happens when you play Resident Evil 4 Mercenaries and Wesker has a silencer in its inventory, but all the enemies automatically know where you are when you spawn. Anyway, this is Renegade Operative signing off. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this sort of deep dive into the prototypes of Resident Evil 0, the prototype builds and the developer interviews where they talked about all this information. I will try to leave everything in the description, and I will at least try to edit this video up a little bit so you can see some of this information coming to fruition. Yet again, I really appreciate it. Like the video, share, subscribe, hit that bell notification if you want to get all my videos. I'm on social media in the description below, and I have one more sort of close off for this video. After the social media shameless plug section comes into play, I'm going to also show you guys the cut levels that were discovered in the Resident Evil 0 trial version. Once again, have a good day. Hopefully you enjoy, and it's time to see some cut content. Here we go.